I'm Naparat Kranrattanasuit. I'm a lecturer of the Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies, Mahidol University. This class will be on migrant workers and trafficking. Let's start this class by looking at the history of people traveling for work. People have traveled for work throughout the history. However, because of the changing nature of work and because of globalization, the number of people traveling for work is the highest ever. When someone is working in a country where they are not a citizen, they tend to need protection. As a non-citizen, people can face difficulty getting access to legal protection. For instance, migrant workers have gradually been expelled from the country where they work in without getting any justice. Also, they can be vulnerable to exploitation. For example, domestic migrant workers can be abused in the houses they work. It is important to remember that over 97% of people live and work in their own country. Migrant workers are a small but very important part of the labor economy. They do not spread out evenly around the world. For example, in Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand contain over 10% of people work in a country as migrant workers, whereas in Indonesia, Philippines, the number of migrant workers is very little. Globalization is the increase in people, goods, and money crossing border. This is a period of significant economic growth. Factories move from the developed into developing countries, such as from Japan to Laos, Indonesia, and Thailand, whereas cheap laborers move to the developing countries as well. Cheap laborers worked in sectors like agriculture, manufacturing to do jobs where their own people will not do. Laborers move from one country to another country. For instance, in Southeast Asia, people from Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Indonesia will move to Thailand, Singapore, and Malaysia. People started migrating for work from the 1950s and 1960s. For instance, people migrated from Southern Europe and the Middle East to Northern Europe. Many people left the poorer countries of Europe for Canada, the United States, and Australia. Most of them were migrants. They took up citizenship and lived in the countries of destination. More recently, many migrants in Southeast Asia leave for work with a plan to eventually come back after a period of years. There has been a large number of people migrating in the Middle East countries like Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Moreover, many of migrant workers, millions of them, work in other destinations countries like Taiwan and South Korea. With any significant movement of people like this, crimes and human rights violations can occur. Many migrant workers can face problems at the workplace with the conditions of work that they are not really expected. The worst form of violations is when they are in traffic situation. For instance, domestic workers can be threatened, can be forced to work, or even some migrant workers can be forced in the commercial sex work. We will return to human rights issue later. Now, we're going to look at the rights of migrant workers. The International Convention on the Protection of All Migrant Workers and members of their families is the standard to protect migrant workers. This convention has been around for 20 years but has not been ratified widely. So now let's look at the rights of migrant workers and then discuss why it's not widely ratified.
The International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and the members of their families was adopted by the UN in December 1990, but it was a further 13 years before it came into force as a treaty in 2003. the Convention has some important features. Firstly, it defines who is a migrant worker. As the title of the treaty notes, it protects all migrant workers, including both documented and undocumented workers, although documented workers are also entitled to an additional set of rights, such as rights to foreign trade unions or access to housing. A documented migrant worker simply means if a person has the documents required by the state to work in that country. The definition of a migrant worker is found in Article 2 of the Convention. It says that a migrant worker is a person who is to be engaged, is engaged, or has been engaged in a remunerated activity in a state of which he or she is not a national. The main elements of this definition are, firstly, that their rights start before they work, and they continue on after their job is finished. This protects migrant workers from violations when they are recruited to work, or if they are unfairly dismissed from their job, or have to stop work because of illness or injury. Second, a person is a migrant worker if they are paid to do a job. It does not need to be a legal job, a full-time job, or a particular kind of labor. Finally, there is no distinction between documented and undocumented workers. A migrant worker is anyone working outside of the country of their citizenship. The treaty also gives rights to members of the migrant worker's family. The treaty protects the wives or husbands and children. Family members should have rights to access health, education, and have security from being mistreated or deported from the country where they work. The treaty details categories of workers who are not considered as migrant workers, such as investors, development workers, students, and refugees. Different kinds of migrant workers have different rights recognized by the treaty. For example, frontier workers, who are people whose jobs means they work across borders, by maybe living in one country and working in another, don't need rights for their family as they live in their country of citizenship. Other categories include itinerant or seasonal workers who are employed for a short term. There are three broad categories of human rights in the Migrant Worker Convention. Firstly, there are existing human rights which the worker should be entitled to anyway, because they are human. But some countries try to deny this to migrant workers. These include rights like access to justice and freedom from arbitrary arrest. While anyone should have these rights, some countries deny undocumented workers access to a court because they are not considered legal by the state. If a worker cannot access a court, they may be cheated of wages or unable to get compensation if they are injured at work. Other rights like this in the Convention include non-discrimination, freedom of expression, and religion. Second, there are new rights specific to migrant workers. There are a number of them, including a right to access consular services of their embassy, to be able to transfer earnings or remittances back to the migrant workers' home country, ensuring the easy return of migrants to their home country, and not allowing workplaces to confiscation or destroy identity cards. A common practice in some factories is to keep or confiscate migrant workers' identity cards or passports, so it is difficult for them to leave and find other jobs. Third, there are rights for the members of the migrant worker family. This includes the right for children of migrant workers to have access to education, for family members to access healthcare, freedom of movement, and political participation. The Migrant Worker Convention took a long time to come into force. It was drafted for over a decade and took 13 years to reach its 20th ratification. It is currently the least ratified human rights treaty. Let's now look at who has ratified the treaty and some expert view on why ratification is so low.
In the region, the Migrant Worker Convention has been ratified by 3 countries: Indonesia, Philippines, and East Timor. Cambodia signed it but have not ratified it yet. According to ILO, in Southeast Asia, there are 3 countries with significant numbers of migrant workers. These are Thailand with about 3.7 million, Malaysia with about 2.5 million, Singapore with around 2.3 million. The countries which send the most of its workers overseas according to the ILO of 2014 is the Philippines and Indonesia with 5 million migrant workers each overseas, Myanmar with about 2.7 million and Vietnam with 2.6 million. Do note that this is the number of registered workers. The number of Myanmar migrant workers, included unregistered workers, is estimated at about 4.5 million by other sources. For trafficking, only Brunei has not ratified the Palermo Protocol. The most recent country to ratify is Singapore in 2015. 7 countries in Southeast Asia also have domestic laws preventing trafficking. 3 countries, Laos, Singapore, and East Timor, do not. However, some domestic laws do not prevent the trafficking of males.
Anyhow, other countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand haven't ratified the convention because they are receiving countries, and they may afraid that ratification of the Migrant Worker Convention may make them have more burden, right, to the migrant workers and the family, and that will be obstruct, the promotion of the investment. And they want to reduce the cost of the investment because they want to make the competition to other countries.
One of the big challenges when it comes to businesses not respecting worker rights is there has to be a clear legal framework in place, as well as a kind of reliable regulatory environment. That means that the businesses can turn to the law and the workers can turn to the law, and there's a sort of clear, common understanding of the expectations, the standards, and there's the idea that these things are actually enforceable. And in the region, you have a situation where governments may not provide such kind of frameworks, and they also may be lackluster in enforcement, and creates kind of a lot of uncertainty when it comes to protection of labor rights.
What are some challenges for making business respect workers' rights?
Business enterprises in the region may try to find ways of avoiding or finding loopholes when it comes to labor rights and workers' rights. And this creates a real tough situation for workers and labor in general, because when they face violations or exploitation from businesses, they may turn to the law and find that the law does not help them in the way that it should. And so you have a situation where governments and businesses alike are underperforming on the when it comes to workers' rights and labor rights.
It's clear that few countries have ratified the Migrant Workers Convention. Importantly, no country in the region that receives a lot of migrant workers has ratified it. States are reluctant to ratify the convention because of different reasons. For instance, they are concerned about giving too many rights to workers. They may be under pressure from business. They may fear wages increases or too many migrant workers will come. All of these reasons are not likely to occur. After looking at the status in the region, we are now going to look at a case studies of migrant workers in Thailand. The following case studies examine the rights of Burmese migrant workers at Mahachai Seaport. The Thai fish processing industry is a significant part of the Thai economy, and the work for this is mainly supplied by Burmese and Cambodian workers. We are going to turn to one of the most severe violations faced by migrant workers, which is trafficking. Trafficking is a kind of slavery where people find themselves in a position of exploitation and they cannot escape. Slavery has existed for centuries. Slavery is where a person becomes property and is owned by someone else. They must work for no money and no freedom to escape. Many Southeast Asian countries had a slave economy, and the ownership and sale of slaves were legal. This practice has been made illegal in Southeast Asia for over a century. A modern form of slavery is trafficking, where a person is exploited for their labor and they cannot escape. Trafficking is a category of slavery. Since the 1990s, with the rise of globalization, trafficking has become more widespread. The increased mobility of people and changing work conditions allowed for international criminal networks to engage in trafficking. As a response, states adopted the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and its Trafficking Protocol. This is not a human rights treaty, though it does protect the human rights of trafficked persons. Mainly, it is a criminal treaty which identifies the crime of trafficking. Let's look at this treaty in more detail, and then we'll hear from some expert about what treaty means.
Human trafficking is considered a type of slavery. It is when a person is moved into a situation where they are exploited. There have been laws against trafficking for over 100 years, but modern laws on these only appeared in the early 2000s. The reason for the laws on trafficking at this time were in response to the increase in people being trafficked. While trafficking did exist before, and other human rights treaties like CEDAW and CRC making reference to trafficking, there was a worrying increase in the 1990s due to transnational organized crime and more people traveling in search of work. The international standard on trafficking is called the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, which is one of 3 protocols to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime adopted in the year 2000. It is normally called just the Trafficking Protocol or sometimes the Palermo Protocol after the Italian city where it was drafted. The convention and its protocols are in direct response to the rise in transnational crime previously mentioned. The Trafficking Protocol achieves a number of things. It criminalized trafficking at an international level, making it easier to arrest recruiters and traffickers. It defines trafficking. It gives rights to victims of trafficking, and it outlines activities that countries should be doing to eliminate trafficking. Let's first look at the definition of trafficking. It is rather long and detailed, but it can be divided into 3 elements. For a situation to be defined as trafficking, all 3 elements must exist. The first element is the action. This is what someone has to do to commit the crime of trafficking. The actions include recruiting, transportation, harboring, or receiving a person. The importance here is that the entire process, from first recruiting the victim to the exploitation, is criminalized. Anyone involved in any of these activities is committing the crime of trafficking. The second element is the means, which is how the person got trafficked. This is what the traffickers do to ensure the person ends up in a traffic situation, such as coerce, abduct, or deceive someone. The final element is the purpose, or why the person is trafficked. To be the crime of trafficking, the purpose has to be for some kind of exploitation. For example, forced labor or sexual exploitation. Exploitation involves a person forced to work, under threat, or who cannot escape this situation. The protocol gives protection to victims of trafficking, such as rights to privacy, psychological assistance, and helping them to return to their home country. Most important, it says that victims of trafficking should not be considered criminals themselves, even if they are in a country without proper documents. There is a perception that most people who are trafficked are captured and forced to do sex work. While this does happen, most victims of trafficking tend to be people working in forced labor. Often, people travel for work and start a proper job, but end up in a situation of trafficking. In Southeast Asia, the industries known for having trafficked people include fishing and fish processing, domestic labor, and agricultural work. It is more common for non-citizens to be trafficked than nationals, because nationals can escape to the police for protection. whereas non-citizens may be afraid to go to the police, or they don't speak the language, or they are scared to seek help because they are illegally in a country. Let's now look at how states and civil society are responding to trafficking.
There are a number of forms of trafficking in Southeast Asia. One form of much concern is women and children trafficked for sex work. This may be the most exploitative kind of trafficking. Women may think that they are traveling to another country to work in a factory, but find that they are forced to work as a sex worker for little or no money. Another form of trafficking is when people are trafficked into slave labor. They may be trapped in a factory or cannot leave, or forced to do domestic work and cannot leave the person's house. A recent example which is getting much press interest is men who are trafficked onto fishing boats. They may be stuck out at sea for years and receive no pay when they finally make it back to shore. Even some of the fishermen have gone missing. Presumably, they died or were killed while on the boats. In order to stop trafficking, there are many procedures. Firstly, it is expected that governments should have laws against trafficking. As we saw before, there is the Palermo Protocol, which is recognized by nearly all Southeast Asian countries. There are domestic laws, and most, but not all, countries have trafficking laws. A problem is that some of these laws only recognize the trafficking in women, but not men, or only criminalize sex trafficking, but not slave labor. Another way to combat trafficking is to prevent it occurring in the first place. This can be done by educating people who are vulnerable to trafficking, such as people who are planning to migrate, or to educate people about trafficking. Finally, another important element is to protect the victims of trafficking. This involved identifying victims of trafficking, which can be done by family, by the police, or other government services. Border police can be important in identifying someone who may be crossing the border into a traffic situation.
This concludes the class on the rights of migrant workers and the crime of trafficking. We have looked at the treaties which protect migrant workers, how trafficking is defined in international law. In the region, there are still people who face trafficking or workplace violations, and some countries in Southeast Asia could be doing more to protect people from this. The challenges are not faced by states alone, as non-citizens can face discrimination from citizens who are against foreigners in the country and think migrant labor is bad for their economy. However, it is clearly proven that migrant workers contribute significantly to many economies in the region, and without them, countries would be poorer and work would not get done. So migrant workers' rights are important not just to protect the workers, but to ensure safe and secure development in Southeast Asia.